Good evening, everyone. Is that working? Let's see. Good evening, everyone. That's working now. Hi, I'm Kevin Adler, and I'm delighted that we have such a good crowd here for the for a We Are Takoma event. I'm a member of the Arts and Humanities Commission, and we organize this and numerous other events every month. And I thought I'd take a minute before I introduce our speaker, David, to just tell you about the range of things that we have going on, and to encourage you to keep coming to our We Are Takoma events. There's an email registration list out there too. So we have a film coming up. It's actually there's a film, a series of sort of short documentary films that's coming up next week, and we have a range of other things, music and dance and so on. And in fact, we just worked out our schedule. We accepted the activities and presentations for the fall, and we've got a photographer who's an award-winning photographer, and he takes pictures of the Chesapeake Bay, and he's going to speak about that. And we have an African dance performance, and just a wide range of things. So please keep coming. All the events are free. And we're delighted to have you here tonight. For tonight's presentation, we have David Rotestein. He's a historian. He's an activist. He lived in this area for a while, and then moved to Georgia, and then came back here a few years ago, and sort of really hit the ground running with some work on. I guess I might call it a hidden history of Silver Spring, or a forgotten history, and I've heard him speak on this issue, and it's a real eye opener, and I'm looking forward to both his presentation, and I think we'll have some time at the end for some questions and comments. So I think you'll all be you'll find it eye opening. So welcome, David.
Thank you, Kevin, and thanks to the City of Takoma Park for inviting me here this evening, and thank you all for coming out. So this story actually begins in a little suburb of Atlanta, Georgia, called Decatur. We moved to Decatur, Georgia in early 2011, and I was continuing my work on historic preservation cases here in Montgomery County and elsewhere in the United States. And as we were settling into our new home, things began to look a little weird. A lot of African Americans were moving out of their homes, and homes were being torn down to be replaced by massive McMansions. I quickly found that Decatur had a very interesting housing history and a very interesting ethnic history. So I began asking questions in the neighborhood, and those questions moved into documentary research, and then moved into more questions, and eventually it started filling filing cabinets full of material for a book on gentrification and how history and historic preservation are produced in American suburbs, with Decatur being my case study. But as I was learning about the gentrifying neighborhood where we had moved, I was looking beyond its borders to understand how Decatur came to be Decatur. Decatur likes to call itself, and I'll show you a slide in a little bit, the city of homes, schools, and places of worship. Well, as I was asking my questions, reading the documents, and taking pictures and shooting video, I was also seeing a whole lot of things coming down besides single-family houses, like these segregation-era schools that were built in the 1950s to try and get around the Brown v. Board decision. So too were the historic housing projects that were built. These were some of the first African-American housing, public housing built in the United States in the former Beacon community in downtown Decatur. And the churches were also coming down. This was Antioch AME Church in its third location and last location in the city of Decatur before it had been pushed out by gentrification. It had actually moved here as a result of urban renewal. The questions I was asking of the buildings and the people and the history of Decatur started to take on a very dark tenor to them. Decatur has the unique honor of being the only city in the United States for having a Tuesday through Saturday school week for 30 years in the early 20th century, specifically to keep Jews from living inside the city limits. Decatur's exclusionary policies, racism, anti-Semitism, continue to today. Part of the research I was doing there uncovered a troubling demographic trend. Between 1980 and the early 2000s, Decatur had lost more than 50% of its African American population. Some estimates put it up as high as 60 to 70%. By the time I left Decatur with all of this data bound again for Silver Spring, the only place you could find African American history and stories about the Black experience in Decatur is under glass in the Beacon Municipal Center, the fancy new complex they built to replace those two equalization schools. So when I got back to Silver Spring, I wanted to find comparative material for my understanding of how things were happening in Decatur. So I immediately started digging into how Silver Spring and Montgomery County produces its history and its historic preservation. Decatur, to give you an example of how it produces its historic preservation, hired a consultant in 2009 to survey every building in the city, take pictures, write detailed histories, and recommend properties for historic designation under the local law and under the National Historic Preservation Act. African Americans have lived in Decatur for its entire history, ever since the city was incorporated in 1823. The words Black and African American appeared nowhere in that 2009 document. As I was digging into the Silver Spring and Montgomery County materials, I found the same thing in Silver Spring and Montgomery County. Books published in 2000, the Central Business District Historic Resources Survey paid for by Montgomery County, and the local Historical Society's history book on Silver Spring. The words Black and African American appear nowhere in those documents, nor do the stories of Jim Crow, of housing segregation, and of the Black experience that defined much of Montgomery County for its entire history. So in order to talk about Silver Spring, there are a few Silver Springs that you can look at. You can look at the Silver Spring on the map, you can look at the Silver Spring published in history books, and you can look at the Silver Spring that's been constructed out of various narratives and this romantic image of the past and how we came to be today. I like to break Silver Spring up into three distinct Silver Springs. The first one is the romantic Silver Spring. That's the romantic story attached to Francis Preston Blair and his horse ride that ultimately identified a microflecked spring in the 1840s. Then you have the entrepreneurial Silver Spring, which is this 20th century place that was created by real estate entrepreneurs trying to craft an all-white middle-class suburb for the growing federal government that was migrating to work in Washington, D.C. And then the third Silver Spring is the nostalgic Silver Spring. This is the Silver Spring that's been constructed by journalists, bloggers, the Historical Society, and people producing historic preservation documents for Montgomery County. So how did we get to this nostalgic Silver Spring? I have to give you a capsule history of Silver Spring's history. Francis Preston Blair was a Kentucky native who came to Washington, D.C., went into the newspaper business, became a confidant of Abraham Lincoln. He's the reason Silver Spring has its name. As I said, he was on a horse ride, found a microflex spring, and the rest is history. Well, Silver Spring actually began as a series of small hamlets that were clustered around the crossroads of what's now Georgia Avenue and Colesville Road. For a long time, you had a community called Sligo. You had the Blair properties at the district line. And then as you got farther out, you had more of these residential subdivisions that started filling in right around the turn of the 20th century. But the Silver Spring history that we have today is fully this romantic Silver Spring that you can find encapsulated in signs and books and videos and websites. What's not often relayed about Francis Preston Blair is he was an enslaver. He was a fairly sizable slaveholder on the eve of the Civil War. But like many of Lincoln's cadre, Blair joined the Republican Party. Immediately after the Civil War, as Reconstruction ramped up, Blair's entire family decamped from the Republican Party, went back to the Democratic Party, and pursued a multi-generational agenda of racial segregation, and we're going to see some examples of that in a little bit. But what's interesting about the Blair family is, despite all of the romanticization of the Blairs and their extended kin, the Lees, Blair made a name for himself, actually all of the Blairs, for proposing to resettle the now freed Africans either back in Africa or South America or Haiti. So the title of this talk is Silver Spring Sundown Suburb. You might have heard the term sundown town, which is a phrase used to describe cities mostly in the north, mostly in the east, that developed throughout the late 19th, early 20th centuries, where by law and by strict social practice, African Americans simply couldn't leave. The communities got their names because oftentimes there were signs posted at their corporate limits telling African Americans that once the sun goes down, you ain't welcome here. None of these signs actually survive today, nor do we have any pictures that actually depict this. All we have are the drawing renderings, but we do have some things that fairly approximate them, like this sign that went up in Detroit after a housing project was proposed. In the early 20th century, cities began passing what were known as racial zoning laws. These were laws that specifically stated which blocks African Americans could live in and which blocks white folks could live in. The first city to pass a racial zoning law was Baltimore. Very quickly after that, cities throughout the eastern United States passed racial zoning laws, including Atlanta, Georgia, and Decatur. Decatur took its racial zoning law directly from the city of Atlanta. But basically, this was a very explicit piece of legislation that spelled out where African Americans could live and the supposed reasons for keeping the races separate in housing. Silver Spring didn't have corporate limits because Silver Spring's not a city. Silver Spring didn't have signs specifically telling African Americans to be gone by sundown, but there were other tools that the white hegemony, the white developers and power structure used to keep their community exclusively white. This is a real estate subdivision sign put up by E. Brooke Lee's North Washington Realty Company in Northwest Washington. Lee was a major real estate speculator here for much of the 20th century. So these signs undoubtedly were located in Silver Spring as well as Northwest Washington. But you notice it says a restricted home development. That was the clue that this was a whites-only community. So we had literally hundreds of these subdivisions developing throughout Montgomery County between 1900 and 1948, when the Supreme Court ruled racial restrictive covenants unenforceable. So we didn't have the you got to be out by sundown signs. We had these. So the real estate speculators developed these all-white communities by carving up land that had once been farmland, creating small building tracts, maybe starting some building sites on them themselves, and then marketing them as highly restricted, protecting restrictions that will be rigidly enforced. Rigidly enforced meant threats of litigation. If a property owner decided to try and sell to a black family, every other property owner in that subdivision would then file a lawsuit against the so-called offending property owner. But these are examples from communities up in the Four Corners part of Silver Spring. The first racially restricted residential subdivision created in Silver Spring was by R. Holt Easley in the early 1900s. As far as I can tell, this is the first racial restrictive covenant attached to a deed in Silver Spring. This was filed in the Montgomery County Courthouse in 1904. So to give you a flavor for what the language reads like, and this is still part of the legal record, so white, black, Asian, Native American, you go to the Maryland State Archives, you go to the Montgomery County Courthouse, you pull the full title history for your property, eventually you're going to run into some language like that. So to give you an example of Arholt-Easley's approach was, whereas the death rate of persons of African descent is much greater than the death rate of the white races and affects injuriously the health of town or village, goes on and on. So basically, it covenants the buyers, their heirs, their assigns, that they will not sell, convey, or rent the premises hereby covered, the whole or any part of any dwelling or structure thereon, to any person of African descent. So that was 1904. That was the first one. You can see the Silver Spring Railroad Station, Georgia Avenue, and then that plot of land to the east. If you think it was isolated and only a few of these guys did it for a very short period of time, this is Sissel's subdivision and the racial restrictive covenant filed in 1926. That reads, for the purposes of sanitation and health, neither the grantee, her heirs, or assigns shall or will sell, grant, lease, rent, or convey the said premises to any parties of a race whose death rate is higher than that of the white race. So here we are, 1940, eve of the Second World War. This is Indian Spring Country Club, Indian Spring Club next to the Country Club, developed by Washington Jewish developer Jack Kay. No person of any race other than the Caucasian race shall use or occupy any building or any lot, except that this covenant shall not prevent occupancy by domestic servants of a different race domiciled with an owner or tenant, which meant that the only way a person of color could live under one of these roofs was if he or she was a domestic servant, a maid, a housekeeper, landscaper, gardener, whatever. I'm going to jump over to Bethesda for a moment here, just to show you that this was pretty widespread throughout the county, and it wasn't just restricted to African Americans. This is the racial covenant attached to Sumner, which was developed by the A.N. and the W.C. and A.N. Miller Development Company. No part of the land hereby conveyed shall ever be used or occupied or sold, demised, transferred, conveyed unto or in trust, blah, 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 to Negroes or any person or persons of Negro blood or extraction, or to any person of the Semitic race, blood, or origin with which racial description shall be deemed to include Armenians, Jews, Hebrews, Persians, and Syrians. Pretty thorough. So if you think that these people disappeared from the landscape when civil rights laws were passed and when it became legally impossible to discriminate against housing, and by some miracle these folks would be driven out of business, this is Bethesda a few weeks ago. W.C. and A.N. Miller are still in business. They date their company back to 1912. They were so infamous. When you talk about racialized housing practices in Montgomery County, Chevy Chase comes to mind immediately. Some of the bad actors out there were much worse than Francis Newlands and the company that he helped create. In 1959, the Miller Company was so notorious that several people testified before the Civil Rights Commission detailing their practices in Washington and Montgomery County. So when I describe Silver Spring as a sundown suburb, you know, it's not a couple blocks here, a couple blocks there. If you take all of those racial restrictive covenants, whether they were included in individual deeds or put in as blanket petitions by the subdividers, what you get is a little over a 10 square mile area bordering the District of Columbia where African Americans simply could not live. There were a couple exceptions, and the color shaded subdivisions only represent the ones that were developed between about 1900 and 1948. The ones with the blue shading are ones that didn't have racial restrictive covenants. So for example, you have the spaces near Littonsville and the subdivisions that developed around Littonsville. But for the most part, Silver Spring was a pretty white place for a very long time. How did Silver Spring get to be a white place? Primarily E. Brooke Lee. E. Brooke Lee, if there's a founder of modern Silver Spring, this entrepreneurial Silver Spring, it's E. Brooke Lee. He was the son of Francis Preston Blair Lee, was the controller of the Treasury, served in the Maryland House of Delegates for Montgomery County, was Speaker of the House of Delegates, was the Maryland Secretary of State, and was a founder of our current Montgomery County Planning Department, the MNC PPC. Lee had this grand vision where he and his business partners and all of the other folks developing residential subdivisions in what's now known as this greater Silver Spring would have a lock on this massive area north of Washington, D.C. So they created a chamber of commerce, they founded a newspaper, and they began selling very heavily the idea of a wonderful place to live within driving distance of federal offices in Washington. Over the years, they came up with clever ideas to sell their subdivisions and built fashionable homes of the styles popular at the time, a lot of period revival cottages, Cape Cods, Tudor revivals, bungalows. And they came up with clever marketing techniques like the bachelor girl home for this subdivision up in Four Corners, which was targeted towards young women coming to Washington to work for the federal government. Or the bride's home, get them at all life stages. So all of the wonderful amenities attached to this home, again, accessible to Washington, a scenic area, and all white. Some of them even went farther than just thinking about modern appliances, modern building materials. Some of them, like this clever developer, offered a car to go in that fancy new garage. But it wasn't just limited to single-family housing. Montgomery County also developed a lot of multifamily units, like the Falkland Apartments, that up until very recently, I'm saying 1970s, was all white. Montgomery Arms in downtown Silver Spring, historic property, like the Falkland Apartments, designated historic in Montgomery County's master plan for historic preservation. But if you read the historic preservation documents, the role that race and exclusion played in the development of these properties appears nowhere in those histories. To public accommodations and recreation, Silver Theater, beloved building in downtown Silver Spring, very historic by any measure. There are people in the Northwest Washington and Montgomery County communities who refuse to acknowledge that the Silver Theater has moved beyond its racist roots. Unlike some theaters, like in, say, Alexandria and much of Washington, where you had a white section and a so-called colored section, which were maybe separated by rope or a balcony, some of the business owners in Silver Spring wouldn't even serve African Americans. Black money was no good in places like the Silver Theater. So what did African Americans do for recreation in and around Silver Spring? Some of them came to Takoma Park. 1959, the city of Takoma Park completed the Hefner Recreation Building. It was their first dedicated recreation building, but it was built specifically for an African American community that surrounded it. And the recreation building didn't just serve residents of Takoma Park. People living in Littonsville, just outside of Silver Spring, would walk down the railroad tracks, or if they had enough money, catch a bus to come to teen club, to dances, and other social events, simply because social spaces in Silver Spring, even as late as 1959, 1960, were closed to blacks. At the same time the city built the Hefner Park Recreation Building, it was also doing a little mini urban renewal of its own. At the intersection of Geneva and Ritchie Avenue, fanning out in a general oval area is, or was, a thriving African American community. The recreation building was a was a give back to the community, because when Takoma Park started discussing building its public works facility right in the heart of this African American community, people like Lee Jordan pushed back. So as a result of that pushback, the African American community got the Hefner Park Recreation Building. So where did the African Americans live in Silver Spring? They couldn't live in downtown Silver Spring. They couldn't live in any of the white residential subdivisions. They could live in Littonsville. Littonsville was one of about several dozen African American hamlets and enclaves that developed in Montgomery County right after the end of the Civil War and into Reconstruction. Basically, these communities began typically germinated around a single farmstead or several farmsteads where free persons of color or formerly enslaved people were able to accumulate enough money to buy a piece of property. Those properties then grew into small self-sustaining communities with churches, with stores, with schools. In some of them there were juke joints. Others had houses of ill repute. But their names still appear on our landscape today. So, for example, one that has no name now, Wheaton Lane, is between Four Corners and Wheaton. The Pines, which is on the border of Washington, D.C. and Montgomery County in Rock Creek Park, is actually one of the source areas for the people who ended up building Littonsville at the turn of the 20th century. Another displacement tidbit: when you think about displacement in Washington, D.C., you generally think urban renewal, gentrification. When the U.S. government started condemning properties in the 1890s to develop Rock Creek Park, a significant number of African American property owners and tenants were displaced to build Rock Creek Park. We have Kengar, a familiar name, and then Scotland. All throughout the county, these little communities developed, and they thrived for a while. Silver Spring's other side of the tracks, Littonsville, was founded by Samuel Lytton. He was a free man of color who worked for Francis Preston Blair, managed to save up enough money that by 1853, he bought a little piece of property from the Johnson family just on the other side of the District of Columbia line and started farming there. Apparently he also did some odd jobs along the way, but he made a good living for his wife and his daughter, and he lived there until he died in 1893. By the time that he died, the community had developed a couple of churches, a couple of stores, there was a school underway, a couple of fraternal lodges, a couple of juke joints, and a dance pavilion. Until recently, the fact that there was a dance pavilion, or that Samuel Lytton likely called his property Butler's Park and not Littonsville, is an intriguing little insight into the community there at the turn of the 20th century. But you can see that plat, which was filed in Montgomery County in the early 1900s. It's the first detailed view we have of Littonsville, and one of the only detailed property maps of Littonsville at the turn of the 20th century. After Lytton died, his wife immediately ran into financial trouble, so she took out a mortgage with a lending institution in Richmond, Virginia, that only gave mortgages to African American families in Montgomery County and elsewhere at usurious rates. And many of these African American property owners, it's a familiar story, defaulted, lost their property. Alice Lytton didn't live on the property for 2 years after Samuel's death before foreclosure proceedings were initiated. So you can see some of the documents there that were filed in the legal case. But what's interesting is the spelling here. Samuel Lytton definitely spelled his name with a Y and an O. So we can see the misspelling made on the mortgage document translated to the plat filed by a Washington, D.C. lawyer that became embedded into the community's description. For all we know, had Samuel Lytton lived and had his wife continued to live at the site and make a profitable living, it might be called Butler's Park today. who knows? Unlike those period revival homes that we saw developing in subdivisions built by E. Brooke Lee and his counterparts throughout Montgomery County, the people in Littonsville lived in more modest homes, more vernacular wood frame buildings. Very few, if any, had running water. Very few had electricity. None of the streets were paved. See a dirt street there. WSSC wouldn't even provide hookups to these communities. It was, from the outside, a rough lifestyle. But in the meantime, they built tight-knit, thriving communities with families, with businesses, with fraternal organizations, with thriving churches. People who still live in the Montgomery County area tell wonderful stories of what it was like to grow up in a tight-knit Littonsville or a tight-knit Tobytown or one of these other African-American hamlets. Had a little so-called colored school before integration in 1954. Another example of the vernacular houses there and the unsurfaced streets. Littonsville, throughout the 20th century, quite literally was a stigmatized community embodying everything you associate with a community you describe as the other side of the tracks. The census taker in 1910 used the legal name for the community, Linden, and then in parentheses, Monkey Hollow. Monkey was a common name applied to names in Montgomery County African-American communities. In Rockville, one of the black communities there was called Monkey Run. The name was reprinted in newspapers throughout the 20th century and caused quite a stir in the 1970s when Sylvester Stallone, who grew up in the area, described his childhood and said that he played and lived near Monkey Hollow. Naturally, the folks who lived in Littonsville didn't like to hear it called Monkey Hollow. A community without running water, without paved streets, with little money to improve the houses, little resources to get action by the county to make it equal to those residential subdivisions found elsewhere. Things started to decline. You had the Monkey Hollow stigma attached to the community. Montgomery County in the early 20th century built one of 2 trash incinerators in the community. It quite literally was the place where Montgomery County dumped. By the mid-1960s, when Montgomery County started pursuing urban renewal funds, which, by the way, it's kind of interesting when you think about urban renewal, you think about places like Southwest Washington, inner city Chicago, Harlem, Brooklyn, Atlanta. Most of Montgomery County's urban renewal was rural renewal. Littonsville was one of the top project priorities that Montgomery County selected to disintegrate, buy up large swaths of land, sell it off to developers, and create the highest and best use for the property. In the meantime, the African Americans living there had to make do with an entirely new community if they were able to move back at all. So when I said Montgomery County embarked on urban renewal, this is an urban renewal map that Montgomery County produced in the late 1960s, showing its project areas. Coincidentally, most of these project areas correspond to the locations of those African American hamlets and enclaves that developed between the Civil War and the middle of the 20th century. As urban renewal and increased pressure from surrounding Silver Spring pushed in on the residents of Littonsville, I think this picture says it all. You have modernity looming over what's left of the traditional community. So that was Silver Spring between the late 19th century and the start of the Cold War. How did these racial barriers come down? They didn't come down all that easily, and much of Montgomery County wasn't willing to take them down at all. Some key landmarks in breaking down Jim Crow in Silver Spring and throughout all of Montgomery County One of the first ones was in 1962 when Montgomery County passed its open accommodations law. Washington, D.C. had already had its accommodations open for about a decade by this point, and Montgomery County had been targeted by civil rights organizations for about 7 years before 1962. It's easy to read the legal history of Montgomery County's open accommodations law and think, that sounds pretty straightforward. Everybody else was doing it. Why not just get with the times and pass an anti-bias law? It's not that simple. As I said, there were civil rights organizations pressuring the county from about 1955 on. One of the tactics they used was to publish lists of businesses that discriminated with the intent to embarrass and shame these people into getting with the program and joining modern America. So these are the businesses identified in Silver Spring that simply would not serve to African Americans in 1961. 1961 is a very pivotal year in Montgomery County and Silver Spring civil rights history. The federal government during the Cold War was embarking on this program of dispersal. They were trying to move critical functions outside of the Washington core, and indeed outside of all urban cores, to minimize the damage that might occur in the event of a nuclear attack. That might have played into the reasoning behind the Department of Labor to move its offices out to Silver Spring. Might be that they were experiencing some growth problems and were running out of office space. Regardless of the actual reason, which I've yet to research in the GSA's records, GSA decided to lease a substantial amount of office space in downtown Silver Spring in 1961. Right after the lease was announced, Montgomery County realized they were going to have a problem. If the federal government was going to import several hundred African American people to Silver Spring and Rockville and Bethesda, where are these people going to eat lunch? Where are these people going to live? Where are these people going to go to the doctor or anything else that normal people do in the course of a workday? Ultimately, Montgomery County in early 1962, right after the Department of Labor moved to downtown Silver Spring, passed its open accommodations law. One of the workers in the Department of Labor office on Georgia Avenue was a man named Roscoe Nix, an African-American man, Army veteran, up-and-comer in the federal government. He decided to go to a restaurant in Silver Spring in the spring of 1962, a couple of months after the open accommodations law was passed. See Mr. Nix. And he and his party were asked to leave. They weren't served. That case worked its way through the courts for about 4 years, was the first formal case filed under Montgomery County's Human Relations Commission, and it led Roscoe Nix on a career away from being a Department of Labor bureaucrat to a civil rights leader. And we're going to get back to Roscoe in a little bit. But at the same time as Montgomery County was getting into the 20th century with breaking down barriers in public accommodations, it had to deal with housing. If you were a person of color and you had to work in Silver Spring or Rockville or Bethesda or anywhere else in Montgomery County, you very likely had a very long and expensive commute. So there were some ways that local nonprofits and civic activists found to kind of push things towards open housing. One of the things was the creation of the Suburban Maryland Fair Housing Organization, which created a list of whites willing to sell and rent to African Americans and African Americans looking for housing in Montgomery County. A lot of Silver Spring residents actually found their homes through that service. But it took a long time between 1962 and ultimately 1968 for the housing laws to open up. So as Montgomery County started trying to find a way to open up housing, public action agencies in Washington helped move them along a little bit. Washington's anti-poverty organization, the United Planning Office, actually started bus service, taking people from east of the river in Washington, D.C. to their workplaces in Silver Spring, Rockville, Bethesda, elsewhere, simply because there was no other way for them to get to work and back. In fact, when Montgomery County was evaluating passing an open housing law, federal officials like the Postmaster General testified to the Montgomery County Council just how hard it was to keep good workers employed because Montgomery County wouldn't open up its housing. There were some exceptions to the rigidly segregated housing, the owners, the developers, the banks who simply wouldn't lend to African Americans. Perpetual Savings and Loan was one of them. They were founded in Washington in the 1880s, built a Silver Spring branch in the 1950s, moved to this location on Georgia and Cameron, nice landmark, modernist building. But what's interesting about Perpetual is, unlike most of the banking institutions of their time, they put in display ads in the Washington Afro-American. They went after African-American homeowners and people wanting to improve their homes. In fact, Romeo W. Horad, a fairly unrecognized civil rights leader in Washington and Montgomery County, was able to build that house with a $10,000 loan from Perpetual Bank. His son, 96-year-old son, who still lives in Montgomery County, who followed his father into the real estate business in the 20th century, told me that whenever they had to deal with a bank, they would always go to Perpetual, an incredibly important bank. Yet when you read the histories of the Perpetual Bank building in Silver Spring, that history is absent. Carl Freeman, you might recognize the name because Freeman carries on a legacy here through a philanthropy that exists long after he died. Many of the apartment communities that are some of the older ones in Montgomery County, and indeed much of the Mid-Atlantic, attribute their histories to Carl Freeman. This map, produced by the Freeman companies in the 1970s, shows the extent of his holdings here in the Washington area. He decided to open up a headquarters in downtown Silver Spring in the 1960s. First in this building, and then in this building on Spring Street. Historic preservation documents tell you a lot about Carl Freeman and what a wonderful developer of first ramblers and then later multifamily housing he was. But what they don't tell you is Carl Freeman was one of the most intransigent segregationists in Montgomery County, and indeed recognized nationally as a racist developer. He was targeted very early on in the 1960s because, as one of the leading apartment community developers in the Washington area, if federal workers coming to Washington, people of color, or members of the military wanted a place to live, Freeman's properties were entirely off limits to them. Freeman was interviewed by the Washington Post because, it was becoming clear that what he was doing was causing a lot of problems, not just for the residents of Montgomery County, but even for federal agencies. He said he favors an open occupancy policy in principle, but that it can't be initiated by one man. So what did civil rights organizations in Montgomery County do to deal with Carl Freeman and his like in the county? They began picketing. So there were massive demonstrations in front of Freeman's offices on Spring Street, in front of Freeman's apartment communities, in front of the apartment communities owned by other developers, who, it just happens to be, were mainly Jewish developers. People who, if you remember that Sumner racial covenant, were prohibited from living in many of the same places that African Americans were prohibited from living in. So the Jews found it a little curious that here's this guy who builds on his history as a religious Jew and good man of faith, yet he's not providing access to housing for some of the region's neediest. So several civil rights organizations grew up around Carl Freeman and the other developers. One of them was Access, the Action Coordinating Committee to End Segregation in the Suburbs, and then a spin-off from that, Jews for Urban Justice, all because of mostly one man's refusal to integrate. So by the end of the 1960s, Silver Spring was a pretty white place still. You know, we're about to go to the moon, we've got nuclear weapons, we've got modern medicine, yet Washingtonian is quoting Silver Spring residents on its most appealing attributes. It's nice, there's no color here. One of the leading purveyors of that attitude was E. Brooke Lee. You know, those open accommodations laws, the open housing laws. Today, and then, we'd call them civil rights laws. E. Brooke Lee, up until the late 1960s, called them anti-white laws. So what we have is a long established, institutionalized history of racial segregation and exclusion in Montgomery County and indeed in Silver Spring. Just because we have open housing laws, just because we have open accommodations laws, just because we now have people of all hues and languages and ethnicities living next to us, working next to us, walking by us on the streets, doesn't mean that racism and white supremacy are gone. We can see evidence of this in redlining that's persisted, reverse redlining or reverse mortgages, and indeed, in the area that I focus on, how history and historic preservation are produced. I'm going to go back to Roscoe Nick's again, that restaurant that Roscoe tried to have lunch in back in 1962, Crevella's Wayside Inn, which was on East-West Highway in Silver Spring. See a little drawing of the restaurant from a matchbook. That's what the building looked like in 2008, 2 years after Montgomery County bought it. In 2009, Montgomery County demolished it, rebranded the entire area Bottle Works Lane, which is that, and completely erased the legacy of Silver Spring's first major civil rights action, Roscoe Nick's entree into civil rights, and eliminated any opportunity for using that building as a way to not just commemorate Roscoe Nick's, but as a African American history and heritage museum, something that the black residents of our county have begged for decades. That's erasure. Yet in downtown Silver Spring, you know, Roscoe Nick's has a school named for him just off the Beltway, off New Hampshire Avenue, and there's a Roscoe Nick's Award. But if you go to downtown Silver Spring, you won't find any evidence of Roscoe Nick's presence there. Roscoe Nick's, for all intents and purposes, has been erased from Silver Spring's history and its cultural landscape. There are about 50 pieces of public art in downtown Silver Spring. Only one of them depicts a human being, a homeless, alcoholic, man suffering from mental illness possibly, the mayor of Silver Spring. He has a bust, piece of public art, and an alley named for him. Roscoe Nick's, whom every civil rights leader in Montgomery County points to as the pioneer of modern Silver Spring, and indeed modern Montgomery County, has nothing named for him in downtown Silver Spring. He has a school, but it's not in downtown Silver Spring. Another way erasure takes place in the landscape in Silver Spring is by insertion. You can go to a little park off of East-West Highway, Acorn Urban Park. I showed you the picture of it. It's the last vestige of the Blair estate. In the 1990s, Montgomery County embarked on this placemaking effort to rebrand Silver Spring and try and jumpstart the economy through redevelopment and through placemaking and public art. So they hired a muralist from Washington, very well-intentioned muralist, who met with Montgomery County officials, Silver Spring residents, and came up with 5 panels to tell the Silver Spring story. This was, as Montgomery County's current planning director said, the first attempt to tell an accurate depiction of Silver Spring history and art. Some major problems with this wall, but I'm just going to focus on this one image because it illustrates perfectly what I'm saying about erasure by insertion. It's the train station and platform. Mame Cohallen, the artist, used this picture snapped in the 1940s and in the collections of the Montgomery County Historical Society as her basis for coming up with this piece of art. But being a Washingtonian and working with African American youth in Washington, she felt that picture lacked something. So what she added were some African Americans to add diversity to the image in a space and in a time when you would have never found African Americans standing on that train platform. Never mind the Jim Crow. The very fact of the matter is most of the African Americans living in Littonsville and the surrounding area couldn't even afford a train ticket. And that's the insertion of black bodies and the erasure of a Jim Crow history that our contemporary histories strive to tell. Another way that we erase history is the same way they erase history in Decatur, Georgia. They simply tear it down and act like it never existed. This is the Talbot Avenue Bridge in Littonsville. You've probably read quite a bit about it in the newspaper lately. It's slated to be demolished by the Purple Line sometime this year, early next year. Built in 1918 by the B&O Railroad. It's a used turntable that oral tradition has coming from a rail yard in West Virginia. Spans the B&O Railroad. On one side of the tracks is historically black Littonsville. On the other side of the tracks, historically white North Woodside. The bridge itself has achieved a tremendous amount of attachment in the black community there. It was their lifeline with Washington, D.C., with shopping, with hair salons, with entertainment, with just about everything that had to do with daily life that was closed off to them in Silver Spring. And it was their lifeline to get to work in Silver Spring. It was the other side of the tracks. For decades, residents in the white neighborhoods near Littonsville would say that we need to have the bridge closed because it's pushing too much traffic into our neighborhoods. And if you talk behind closed doors, white person to white person, to some of those folks in those all-white residential subdivisions, they'll tell you the real reason they wanted that bridge closed. That's racism. The fact that Silver Spring had another side of the tracks is racism. But the way the historic preservation dealt with this bridge that you can sit in a room with an 85-year-old woman and she'll tell you about her childhood, sitting on her parents' porch, listening for her father's car to come across that wood bridge deck, knowing that she could go meet him at the edge of the bridge. Or the children who used to wait on the bridge for the fireworks to start in downtown Washington, which you could still see down the railroad line before the big buildings came along. Historic preservation came along in the 1990s and early 2000s and simply said that the bridge is an excellent example of a plate and rolled girder bridge, a contributing element to the Metropolitan Branch Railroad. For all intents and purposes, for Montgomery County historians, for the state of Maryland, all it was some old wood and metal that was associated with a railroad. Had no ties to the black community, had no ties to civil rights, had no socially redeeming value whatsoever, other than the fact that it was an engineering structure. And you can actually see that language captured in the programmatic agreement that the state of Maryland and the federal government executed that facilitated the bridge's eventual demolition. Again, No discussion of its ties to Littonsville or to civil rights or the black community. It's simply some old metal and wood that has some engineering significance, but no social significance. A couple of years ago, it became known that the bridge had a little more significance than its association with the railroad and engineering and bricks and metal. So once that bridge is demolished, the only thing that's going to be left is one girder sticking up alongside the new Littonsville Purple Line station. That's the programmatic agreement executed by the state of Maryland, State Historic Preservation Officer, the Maryland Transit Authority, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, and the U.S. Department of Transportation. Maryland Historical Trust, yes, that's the State Historic Preservation Office. So once the bridge is gone, all its cultural attachments are gone. No one will ever get to listen to a bridge crossing that includes the wood bridge deck. No one will be able to stand on that structure and take in the surroundings like my friend from London did last summer, and who subsequently wrote a few blog posts about that. There's a very visceral feeling you get standing in the middle of that bridge, because that bridge is a connection between our past, our present, and our future. I like to describe the Talbot Avenue Bridge as a site of conscience. It's a site that speaks to and has origins in great social injustice, slavery, genocide, crime, all of the ills people can visit upon one another. But it also gives us an opportunity to think about that past and find ways to have dialogues with ourselves and with policy, and find ways to end the racism and the exclusion that caused places like that to come into being in the first place, that caused segregation in places like Littonsville, Tobytown, Kengar, and all of the other communities that have now disappeared from the map in Silver Spring. So I'm gonna wrap it up here as a quick whirlwind tour through an aspect of Silver Spring and Montgomery County's history. It probably isn't accessible in your history books, most definitely isn't accessible in your county historic preservation documents, and hopefully will get you to interrogate the historic sites and the landscapes you walk through today and ask, where are the black people? Thank you.
Well, thank you, David, and it certainly exceeded my expectations. Having actually taken a walking tour with him a few months ago of some of these buildings in Silver Spring, but to hear it fleshed out this way was remarkable. We have a couple of microphones here, and we're going to walk around and take some questions, and we'll just start it up.
David, could you say? David, could you say something about the African cemetery off River Road and the struggle around that?
Absolutely. River Road was another one of these dozens of African-American hamlets that emerged after the Civil War, started cohering right around the 1880s, 1890s, and by then the Washington, D.C. boundary was fluid. African-Americans owned property both in Washington and in Maryland. They had churches in Washington but lived in Maryland, worked in Maryland but lived in Washington. River Road was one of these communities like Littonsville and Wheaton Lane and Scotland that grew up around farmsteads along a major transportation corridor. In the 1880s, a fraternal organization in Tenleytown bought a piece of property and started burying its dead there. A couple of decades went by and suburbanization started to push in on them, and the Moses Order had to leave Tenleytown. It was just, it was becoming unpleasant to live there. The Chevy Chase Land Company was pushing in. Racial restrictive covenants were starting to emerge. So they bought a 1 acre tract in the River Road African American community and began the process of disinterring the people from the Tenleytown Cemetery to River Road, and then they continued to bury people there for about 50 more years. In the 1950s, that property was sold. A developer began consolidating parcels, and eventually a parking lot was built on what's now called the Moses Cemetery. West Bard was replanned by the planning department a few years ago, and part of the new sector plan called for the construction of a parking garage on top of this African cemetery, which by some estimates has about 500 graves in it. When I say graves, you have to keep in mind that there are oral narratives that suggest some graves were relocated elsewhere in Montgomery County, and the rest were simply bulldozed over. Well, no matter how many of those graves got relocated, think about what grave relocation in the mid-20th century might have looked like. It wasn't archaeologists with dental picks and paintbrushes and sifter screens and little plastic bags carefully marked. They'd yank the skull out, maybe a couple of long bones, and everything else would just end up being crushed by the heavy equipment. So the cemetery that Don asked about is a small area under a parking lot in Bethesda, but every one of those consolidated parcels along West Bard Avenue off of River Road now is essentially a mass grave, because as the heavy machinery disturbed those graves, crushed and broke and pulverized all of those bones and distributed them through every corner of that property, Montgomery County Housing Opportunities Commission is now the proud owner of historic African cemetery, and the descendants of that River Road community are working to preserve it, get respectful commemoration, and to have it designated historic.
Got one over here.
We'll take turns going one side or the other.
Hi there. My name is Denise, and I live about a block away from that charming little bridge on Talbot Avenue. I see one of my neighbors here, Nancy. I've lived in a condo about a block from there for about 16 years, and I've crossed that bridge several days a week, all the time that I've lived there, to bicycle to work by bicycle. And I had no idea of the historical significance. I really didn't. I'm so grateful to you for your wonderful presentation tonight. So my question is the demolition a fait accompli? And is there anything we can do? The other question is, have you summarized your report, your presentation in a book somewhere? Or did I miss that piece of it?
I'll start backwards. No book yet. I may write a book about African American communities and erasure after I get my Decatur book out of my life, sometime in the next 2 years. To your question about the bridge, yes, that's a done deal. MTA is moving forward with demolition. Montgomery County Council, when they approved the Greater Littonsville Sector Plan, had a great photo op and soundbite by telling the Parks Department and Planning Department to try and find a place in a park for the bridge, which essentially was saying, yeah, we're okay with seeing the bridge go, because under Montgomery County law, the County Council could have directed the Planning Department to begin historic designation proceedings for the bridge, which would have then provided legal historic ordinance protection for it. So they would have had a mechanism to move the bridge to another site, perhaps at that crossing, perhaps somewhere on the trail, to keep it somewhat associated with the crossing. Instead, Montgomery County Council simply did smoke and mirrors and said, you know, we'll think about finding a new home for it. So the bridge is gone. Had the process worked the way it should have, and I know for a fact it didn't work the way it should have, because the bridge was first documented by an archaeologist in the 1990s whose legacy is scattered throughout Montgomery County, because he was trained as an underwater archaeologist, and developers and county governments liked to use him because he was apparently inexpensive and quick and easy to work with. But in the process, he did reports on places like Falkland Apartments, like the Talbot Avenue Bridge, and a whole host of other historic places in Montgomery County that now have grossly incorrect histories attached to them. So every historical evaluation of that bridge was based on that 1995 evaluation by the unqualified archaeologist. Nobody bothered to interrogate whether or not he was accurate in what he was writing, and certainly nobody bothered to get out of their cars or offices and go talk to the people in Littonsville to understand what that bridge might have meant to them. So at this point, the only thing you can do is hold your county officials and state officials accountable for ensuring that they comply in good faith with the historic preservation laws. It's too late. Original Littonsville family members? Yes. Not of the Littons. The Littons disappeared right around the turn of the 20th century, but there are family members who had been living in what's now Littonsville since the turn of the 20th century, and indeed the family members of the people who lived in the Pines, Wheaton Lane, River Road, Hawkins Lane, and a few other of the lower Montgomery County African-American hamlets. They're scattered throughout here, and they still have, believe it or not, a very tight-knit community that's all wrapped up in the church network that they've developed.
My name is Mary. I'm with the Silver Spring Historical Society. David, wherever I say, you're going to have the last word, but I do want to say that you've done really excellent research. I think we've all learned a lot. I really admire your passion on the Talbot Avenue Bridge. The Silver Spring Historical Society book that you showed and the sign that you showed, they do have African American content. A lot of our work involves promoting African American history. Our work is not just the books and the signs. Any history is not going to cover everything. You, at every opportunity, attack the Silver Spring Historical Society. So because not everything is going to be covered, you always have a chance to attack us. A lot of what you say about us on social media is distorting, but some people believe it because they don't check out the facts. In this country, we have a lot of deadly serious problems like mass incarceration of African Americans, poverty, and yet you are on a mission to attack local historians and certain local preservationists. They're an easy target. If people want to have a target to point to easily close by, that's going to be us. You've called us racist, you've called our work racist. I guess if I have to ask a question, I'll ask why, but
No.
it doesn't matter why to me.
Let me answer your questions point by point. First of all, I've never called the Silver Spring Historical Society racist. I've said you've produced racially biased products. Second of all, what you have produced is very, very troubling. And it's not just me. A PhD student at the University of Maryland in 2005 published a 536-page dissertation covering several years of field work with the Silver Spring Historical Society, illustrating racially biased practices and damaging communications to the African American and Latino communities in Silver Spring. So it's not just me. The sign that I showed actually distorts. Yes, it does mention African Americans, but it does so in a very misleading way. It suggests that the owner of the Little Tavern restaurants, wasn't so bad after all because they only had takeout at that location. Well, if you talk to African Americans who grew up in Washington and Montgomery County, if you ask them about Jim Crow, one of the first business establishments they're going to tell you about is Little Tavern and how harmful those business practices were. The language used in that sign is very racially biased and very misleading. It uses what's called a frame of minimization to say, yes, he discriminated, but because he only had takeout, it wasn't so bad. And actually, I am very critical of what the Silver Spring Historical Society has done because the Silver Spring Historical Society has produced very damaging history and historic preservation products. Had the Silver Spring Historical Society done a good faith effort to involve African Americans from the time it was started, we might have a better history of the Talbot Avenue Bridge. Crevella's former restaurant site might have been preserved. Your organization wouldn't have produced an Images of America book that doesn't deal at all with African Americans. The words Black and African American don't appear anywhere in it. Yet you look at Takoma Park's book, the same type of book, same type of material. Wheaton's, same type of book, same type of material. They have extensive sections on the African American communities. I'm sorry, but your organization is very vulnerable to criticisms of racial bias.
We have African Americans in both of our books, and we're not only about our books. In fact, Jerry McCoy in 1994 he was new to Silver Spring, and he took a seminal pro-action regarding our 1937 New Deal Civil War, Civil Rights, Social Justice mural by Russian emigre Nikolai Tchaikovsky of the Social Realism School of Art, who represented hope and liberation. In the mural's central figure, which is in our first book, is an African-American Union soldier in 1864 picking up his mail at the Old Tavern. Over 209,000 African Americans joined the Union forces during the Civil War. Tchaikovsky included this soldier to symbolize the result of the Civil War, the liberation of his race. Jerry headed over to the mural's original setting, which was in the 1836 Colonial Revival post office on Wayne Avenue, then serving as a Whiz record store. But it was no longer there. Jerry searched for, unearthed, retrieved, promoted to, and engaged the community. Friends of the Silver Spring Library mounted a successful fundraising campaign. The mural was restored, mounted, celebrated with fanfare by officials in the community. In 1997, this is very important because Jerry was in the forefront of bringing African American history out in Silver Spring, and that's never recognized, and it should be. So we invite you, and then this mural is in the Silver Spring Library, and it's celebrating its 80th birthday. We invite you to come visit the mural, which is in the library. It's also come to the Heritage Trail sign, which is right there next to the Charm Thai restaurant and Veladas Caramels and the old post office building, and visit the sign in person or at the Silver Spring Library. We'd be glad to meet you at that sign of the mural. And on the other side, I really appreciate, we need to tell you about things that you may not know about, that we can improve your history because you don't know that we have it. And then if we meet you at this sign, we can show you on the flip side of the sign is a Sanborn map to show how all the 1920s and 1930s original buildings are now enlivened by multicultural businesses. And in the past, they were also multicultural. So I would recommend that we can share our information with you. We are not doing racist history. We had an amazing Buffalo Soldier event yesterday at the Civic Building, and we also have William Harps on a perpetual sign. We always said the perpetual building was progressive because it did allow anybody who wanted to live anywhere they want. We need to let you know about that, and we have William Harps' picture on our Heritage Trail sign. In fact, his family provided us with that.
Thanks. That's
I
enough.
would like
I feel
to
like I'm
say
in a
that we
city
need
council
to
meeting at this
communicate
point.
with you, David, so that you can.
Marcy,
you need to
you guys
remove
can
the all-white,
take this
thing
off
from your first
offline. Thanks. We got another question.
Well, we need to communicate, David, and like
You've had your
colleagues.
turn. Thank you. Some of us would like to ask a question before it's time to go to bed. So can you tell, do you know anything about the Juniper Street Bridge, which is Takoma Park's bridge over the other side of the tracks, and any of the history associated with that bridge, which is no longer there now?
I do, and that information's come out through oral history interviews I've done with longtime Shepherd Park and Silver Spring residents. I understand that bridge too has a very contested history, especially within the social divisions that make up not just Silver Spring but Takoma Park. But I'm not in a position to speak about that bridge. But it does warrant a close look about its history and what happened to it in more recent times.
Do we have more questions?
Yeah, I'm curious about another bridge. I think it's on the other side of Littonsville. I used to live on Grub Road, and when you go up the hill and you turn to the right, there's a bridge there that used to be able to have cars go on it. It still stands, but it's blocked off. I mean, you can't. It's too rickety for cars to go across it now. But it's basically at the other end of Littonsville.
I don't
near the
think I'm familiar.
WWDC, I think. It's on Brookville Road, right at the intersection of Brookville Road and Grubb Road. So that's right at that's right at the kind of the borderline between Chevy Chase and Silver Spring.
Yeah, I'm not
You don't know
familiar
that one?
with that bridge at all. Sorry.
Yeah, I wonder whether, kind of up the hill from the Cofield Community Center. So it's really, I just wondered whether both of those bridges kind of blocked in Littonsville. I don't know,
Well-
maybe some of the people who live there would know.
That's possible. I'd ask maybe one of the longtime residents, Charlotte Cofield or Patricia Tyson. They might be able to tell you.
You just have a comment related to that?
Well, I grew up in this area. I lived in the Wheaton, Silver Spring area most of my life, and I'm curious about Wheaton Lane itself. What were the streets around that area? Is there any sign? Because I know there's an AME church off of that's still this.
Allen Chapel. Yeah.
Yes,
It used
the
to be
one that
Allen
right by
Chapel.
University Boulevard and
Yep.
near Inwood.
Mhm.
So I didn't know whether that was a remnant of some of that community, or is that another?
It's a separate community. That actually grew up. A man named Charles Coupard owned that property, perhaps as early as the last decade of the 18th century. When he died in the 1860s, his children inherited it. After it went through a long probate battle, his children sold off much of the property to African Americans who had been living in Northwest Washington and in lower Montgomery County. Initially, it was called Chestnut Ridge. And when Wheaton Lane is a street that comes off Inwood. Inwood
it's
comes
so-
off of University, and then Wheaton Lane goes in. Wheaton Lane was one of those urban renewal areas that Montgomery County targeted. In fact, if you look at testimony from congressional hearings from the 1960s and 70s, Wheaton Lane was one of the top three so-called problem areas in Montgomery County. But it was a fairly cohesive African-American enclave. Its church was at Allen Chapel, which is closer to Wheaton. There's a cemetery there. The church dates back to the late 1870s. There used to be an African-American school just off University Boulevard, which was on property owned by Romeo Horad's wife's family, the Websters and the Sewells. But that's one of those erased African-American communities. But believe it or not, there are still descendants of the families who bought into that community in the 1880s still owning property in Wheaton Lane.
Well, I really am glad that little church is still there. I graduated from Northwood High School in 1966, and there were probably 3 African Americans in our class. And my dad actually did work with the Anti-Defamation League, going through, I think it was probably in that 57 through early 60s time, trying to get people in Woodmore to sign, that they would sell their houses to blacks and Jews, But, anyway, he also, we'll go on. Anyway, but I'm really thankful that you've done this, and we do need more. I would like to see the Silver Spring Historical Society not feeling defensive, because I really feel. Okay, I understand that, but it's. Well, it sounds defensive, but anyway.
To give you a great anecdote about that little church, a woman who's a very well-known civic activist in Silver Spring grew up in those subdivisions in the 1950s, and she gave me this terrific story of the first time she ever heard gospel music. She was playing with her friends at sunset, and she heard this unusual music coming through the woods. So they followed the music back to the church, and they began sitting outside the church listening to the gospel choir practice in the evenings. That church has some incredible stories attached to it. You know who it is? Oh, okay. But
hi. Is my turn? Okay. Hi. So my question is for people who are interested in doing more. Are there any organizations that you know of that are working on these issues, civic groups that are, Lightonsville or wherever, Wheaton, you know, people you've spoken with that are organizing around these issues. I know that with Acorn Park, there was the Montgomery County Surge group recently,
Right.
standing up for racial justice. They did something recently in Acorn Park, but
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
this might be a good way for all of you to find out how you can do more, because I'm charged up. I mean, this is like,
And
yeah.
if you look at the Facebook link down there, I work with Surge and Impact Silver Spring on reframing the narrative around history and historic preservation. And we're actually working on a very large portfolio of projects that involves everything from racial equity in the schools to placemaking in public spaces to Acorn Park. We're working to get a petition live to work with the county to get Bottle Works Lane renamed for Roscoe Nix and his achievements. So if you're interested in getting involved, you know, we meet once a month, and this is just stunning. As a public historian, to meet with my neighbors from all backgrounds and talk about history and public policy once a month, that is incredible. Invisible Montgomery, it's on Facebook. Drop me an email and I'll send you additional information.
I think we've got time for one more question over here.
Back here, and I think David will probably be hanging around a few more minutes if you wanted to chat or exchange, get his email and so on. But two more questions.
So when you talked about these covenants, that they barred not just African Americans, but people of the Jewish faith and any number of other nationalities. And so I'm wondering to what extent, coming a little bit off the question that was just made, to what extent Jewish property owners, including property owners of apartment buildings, may have played a role in reversing those policies and permitting people of all races to rent apartments and so on.
They came very late to the game. Freeman was one of the most notorious holdouts, but Jack Kay, Sam Eig, Morris K. Fritz, they all discriminated. I mean, it was widespread throughout the DC and Montgomery County areas, even though they came from a background where it was very hard for them to accumulate wealth and to accumulate the resources to become entrepreneurs. They in turn decided to become the same type of discriminatory business people that kept them out of the game before they were able to go out on their own. What's fascinating about people like Kay and Eig and Freeman is their assertions that they couldn't profit at selling to black people or to Jews or to other non-white Christians was a total fallacy, because besides the economic studies, all you have to do is look at the Rosemary Village apartments off East West Highway. Those were built as a segregated apartment community in the 1950s and bought in the early 1960s by a very progressive Jewish developer from Philadelphia named Morris Milgram. Milgram is the founder of the Fund for an Open Society, along with James Farmer. They specifically developed a business model of building and then sometimes buying existing segregated apartment communities and then opening them up to all races. So there were progressive people out there doing this, and there were progressive people right here in Montgomery County doing this, but their activities had no bearing whatsoever on the people already here doing business, like Kay, like Eig, and like Freeman.
Well, thank you so much, David. This was.
Well, thank you.
And I hoped it would be.